Hey gamers, Chris here. So, do you have a build that does good damage? Or maybe you have a character that does great damage? Or maybe you have a character that doesn't do as good damage as you were hoping? How do you even know what's good damage or bad damage? I do builds all the time where I talk about how much damage a build does and I say, that's really good damage. And I expect you to kind of take me on faith, I guess, that that's good damage. But that's all going to change today. Today, we are going to talk about damage. Not only am I going to tell you how to determine good damage from bad damage, I'm going to show you how to determine how much damage your character is going to do on average on a hit. But more than that, I'm going to show you how to determine how much damage your character is going to do on average in a round, taking into account chance to hit, chance to miss, criticals, advantage, disadvantage, all that stuff all added together to give you a real estimate of your round by round damage. And then I'm going to give you a baseline for which you can determine if that damage is above average or below average, or maybe fantastic. And if it is, please share it. And the reason I'm doing this video today is because I'm going to be doing another video very soon where I'm going to be taking something that we all agree absolutely sucks, the worst in the game. And I'm going to prove to you that we've misjudged it all along. And I'm going to talk a little bit about it at the end of this video, but I understand that it's not something that we're going to be able to take on faith. We have such an established view on this that me just saying that it's good isn't going to buy it. I have to prove it. And I will. I'll prove it with the numbers. So, are you ready to math? Because today math's a verb, as I welcome you to Tree and Monk's Temple. So let's start with this. Rating damage is good or bad is obviously subjective. We can call any number good or bad. In videos, I often refer to my builds as doing good damage, or maybe I didn't take something because I say it's bad damage. And where do I come up with that judgment from? I mean, we could just follow our gut. We see a number and does that feel like a lot or does that not feel like a lot? But I've learned not to trust my gut. My gut is full of biases. When I see something that I expect to be good, it often seems good. When I see something I expect to be terrible, it often seems terrible, even if those numbers are the same. Instead, if I want to be consistent, I need a baseline. You need to establish a baseline as to what's okay. If you can determine what's okay, then anything above it must be good, and anything below it must be not so good. So I personally thought about this for quite a bit, about what can I put as a baseline, something that I think does okay damage from level 1 right through level 20, so I can establish it as a baseline for which to judge damage by. And I thought about new players at that point. When I see a new player and I want to help them make a character, one of the first things I think of is the Warlock, because it is so easy to help somebody make a Warlock that's decent. All you have to do is you tell them, make sure that your beginning charisma modifier is a +3. Take Hex and Eldritch Blast at first level. When you go into combat, you cast Hex first, and then you cast Eldritch Blast. Or if your Hex is already cast, you place your Hex first, and then cast Eldritch Blast. Then at second level, make sure that one of your invocations is Agonizing Blast. Then at 4th level and 8th level, you're going to increase your Charisma. Just by doing these simple things, we can have a new player fairly simply do decent damage from level 1 through level 20. Now there's ways we can increase that. We could multi-class into Sorcerer, do some quicken spells, tricks like that. But if we're just establishing okay damage, I think this does a pretty good job. A Warlock using Agonizing Blast, using Hex, does decent damage. It's not great, but it's not bad. So the next thing to do is determine just how much damage does this Warlock do at each level. Now in previous videos I've always referred to damage as this is how much damage they do on a hit. This is a simple method of determining damage. It's not completely accurate, but if we are comparing two things that hit about the same amount of time and neither of them specialize in criticals in any way, then using this as a baseline actually still works, even though it's not a completely accurate picture of damage. And the reason it's not a completely accurate picture of damage is because we're not taking into account criticals or the chance to miss. So determining average damage on a hit is pretty easy. If we want to determine the average damage of a die, it's the die type divided by 2 plus a half. So A D6, say from a hex, average damage 3.5. A D10, say from an Eldritch Blast, average damage 5.5. So determining damage this way then is pretty easy. So our Warlock at first level, we got 5.5 plus 3.5, that's 9 points of damage. Then at second level, we're going to add our Agonizing Blast, so now we're up to 12 points of damage. Then at fourth level, we're going to increase our Charisma by 1, so now we're doing 13 points of damage. Then at fifth level, we're going to be firing 2 blasts, so we double it up, now we're at 26. Then at 8th level, we're going to increase our Charisma again, so now it's up to 28. Then we go at 11th level and add a 3rd blast, now we're up to 42. And then finally, at 17th level, you add a 4th blast, and now you are at 56. So this is easy math. Again, this isn't the average damage they're going to do per round. This is the average damage they'll do on a hit. So just remember that these numbers aren't damage per round, but they're still useful for comparison in some cases. If I'm comparing it to a character that has a significantly lower chance to hit or higher chance to hit, not very useful. If I'm comparing it to a character that is going to be attacking with advantage, not very useful. And if I'm going to be comparing it to a character that does extra damage on criticals or has an expanded critical range, again, not very useful. But the method I use is this. If I can equal this damage, then I'm doing damage that's okay. If I'm doing less than that, we're heading into poor. And if I do more than that, we're heading into good. If we do, say, half of this damage, now we're into terrible. And if we can do, say, half again as much as this, then the damage is pretty darn good. And if we can get to double, then we're into terrific. So that's kind of how I judge it. So let's show you how that works. I did a video last week on a build called the Eternal Cockroach. And the Eternal Cockroach took 1 level of Warlock. And when I took that level of Warlock, I took Green Flame Blade and Booming Blade. And I was told in the comments down below, I should have taken Eldritch Blast. And I said, I shouldn't take Eldritch Blast because Eldritch Blast does bad damage. And I was told, actually Eldritch Blast does pretty decent damage. Maybe you don't realize that Eldritch Blast scales at level 5, at a level 11, level 17. Yes, I know it scales, but let's just do the math right now. The average damage of an Eldritch Blast, when my character took it, at level 2, would have been 5.5. The baseline damage at that level, 12. I'm less than half of that. Then at level 5, I'd be going to 11 versus the baseline damage of 26. A lot less than half of that. Then at 11th level, I'm going to 16.5 versus 42. That's just embarrassingly bad. And at 17th level, it remains embarrassingly bad. 56 to 22. Just awful, not worth it. If you have nothing useful to do, and the best you can do is 1/3 to 1/2 of the baseline damage, consider maybe doing the help action with somebody who actually does a lot of damage. You might do more damage that way than doing that crappy Eldritch Blast. Or take the dodge action, or hide, or maybe dash towards the enemy, or buff yourself. There's got to be something you can do more useful than just throwing your action away on something so horrible. So I'm often talking about crappy cantrip damage. That's what I mean. I take a look at my baseline and it's so far below. It's not just a little below. It is so far below, it's less than half as much. It's just not worth it. That's where I come from on that. So now let's talk about how we account for our chance to hit and our chance of doing criticals. So first off, it's hard to know exactly what your chance to hit is because we're always facing opponents with varying armor classes. So sometimes we might have an 80% chance to hit, and in the next battle, we've got a 40% chance to hit. So we kind of have to just determine an average. And the average I've come up with, I think, is reasonably close. It's not perfect, but I think it works reasonably well. Again, I use my baseline Warlock. This is a Warlock that had a +3 Charisma modifier at level 1, and then increased it at 4 and 8, and has no minuses to hit, or no bonuses. And I don't take into account magic items at all, because you never know what magic items you're going to get. And then I assume that this Warlock's going to have about 60% chance to hit. And honestly, that ends up being pretty close to the average. So if we assume a 60% chance to hit, the first thing we need to do is we need to take that 60% and multiply it by our average damage. So let's consider level 1. At level 1, we had 9 average damage. If we consider a 60% chance to hit, that's expressed as 0.6. So it becomes 9 times 0.6 equals 5.4. So before we look at criticals, this character is doing 5.4 average damage at level 1. And the next thing you need to do is add in the damage that you would do extra from a critical. Because we've already looked at the to hit damage from the 20, the base damage you would get when you rolled the 20. So we're only looking at damage above and beyond that. So in the case of our Warlock, we'd be getting 1 extra d10 or 5.5 average damage. And what's our chance of a critical? 5%. So how do we express 5% as a decimal? 0.05. So we take 0.05 and we multiply it by 5.5. That gives us 0.275. So we take our 5.4 plus our 0.275 to give us our total. So our actual average damage at level 1 with our baseline is 5.675, or let's say 5.7. So what we want to do is, if our character is going to have a higher chance to hit than that Warlock, we're going to increase the chance by the same amount. So let's say we have a character that took the archery combat style. So now we're going to have an extra +2 to hit. So instead of multiplying by 0.6, we'll multiply by 0.7. Then if that same character takes the sharpshooter feat and is using the sharpshooter feat, then we need to subtract the -5 that sharpshooter would do. So now we're looking at 0.45. Then you would take that 0.45, multiply it by the new increased damage from the sharpshooter, and then you can figure out how much exactly more you're going to do using sharpshooter, or how much less. So how do we deal with advantage and disadvantage? And the way to do it is actually easier than you would think. So let's go back to our base Warlock. He's got a 60% chance to hit. So that means a 40% chance to miss. If we want to give that Warlock advantage, all we do is we take their chance to miss and we square it. So you would take 0.4 times 0.4. And that will give us a total of 0.16, meaning our new chance to miss is now 16%. So our new chance to hit is 84%. Disadvantage works exactly the opposite. Instead of squaring our chance to miss, we square our chance to hit. But don't forget, when you have advantage and disadvantage, it also affects your chance of a critical. So if we have advantage, then we take our chance of a critical, which is usually 5%, and then we take the chance not to do a critical, which is 95%, and we square that. So then our chance to not do a critical becomes 90.25%, which means our chance of doing a critical has jumped from 5% to 9.75%. Now remember at the beginning of this video I told you about how feeling with your gut isn't very accurate? I'm going to show you how that works right now. So we all know advantage is pretty good. Now let's consider our baseline Warlock. At 17th level, that baseline Warlock could, instead of casting Hex, cast Shadow of Moil. Shadow of Moil would give that Warlock Heavy Obscurement, which would mean they would have advantage on attack rolls. So at level 17, if we're to take our Warlock and do Eldritch Blast plus Hex, how much damage will we do? Well, it's 56 base damage times 0.6 equals 33.6 base damage, plus our critical damage of 0.05 times 36 potential additional damage is 1.8. So our actual average damage, 35.4. Now with Shadow of Moil, we're now removing Hex because we can't concentrate on 2 things at once. So that's removing 14 from the base damage. So we're using a base damage now of 42 times 0.84. That gives us 35.28. Then we take our potential critical damage of 22 times 0.0975, giving us a total critical average damage of 2.145. So our new total is 37.425. Well, let's say 37. Almost identical damage. I mean, the Warlock that used Shadow of Moil does a little bit more. But in the end, that advantage is not a big boost over just using Hex. That to me is a bit of a shock. I usually think advantage is worth more than that. But that D6 really delivers. So that Hex ends up being almost as good as advantage in that case. Now, based on the chance to hit, sometimes advantage means more than that. But we tend to have an emotional reaction to advantage. We're rolling 2 dice. It feels so amazing. But it doesn't always mean a lot more damage. And that's why we do this math, because our gut tells us one thing, but the numbers tell us something else. So what about the Barbarian using the Greatsword? This is kind of iconic. You've got the 1st level Barbarian, you took your +3 strength modifier, and then 4th level comes around, you're using your Greatsword, Do you increase your strength or do you take greater weapon mastery? Now, conventional wisdom tells us that taking greater weapon mastery delivers a whole lot more damage. Does it really? Well, if we're using rage and reckless attack, and reckless attack is kind of a key here because it gives us advantage. So when we have that -5, then we would think that that advantage is going to make up for that -5. But by using this system, we can determine exactly what the difference is. So first, let's look at the strength boost. So if we're looking at the strength boost, we increased our chance to hit, but so did our baseline. Our warlock has also increased their charisma at 4th level. So our chance to hit remains 60%. But because we're using advantage, we know that now becomes 84%. So we use 0.84 times the average damage of the attack. Average damage of the attack includes a +2 from rage, +4 from strength, and an average of 7 from the weapon. So that's going to give us an average of 13. So we multiply that by 0.84 and we get about 10.9. Then if we add our critical damage, which is going to be based on a 0.0975 times our critical damage of 7, we're now looking at closer to 12. Now, if we look at greater weapon mastery, we got to remember that our chance to hit already took a hit because we didn't increase our strength, so we fell 1 against the baseline. And now because we're going to use greater weapon mastery, so that means we need to subtract 0.3 from our chance to hit. So we went from a 60% chance to hit to a 30% chance to hit. But then we're going to apply advantage. So if we apply advantage, remember we have a 70% chance of missing. So if we take 0.7 times 0.7, we end up with 0.49. So suddenly we've gone from a 30% chance to hit to a 51% chance to hit. So what we know right away is, guess what? The advantage doesn't make up for the -5. It just doesn't. Because we're also losing -1 because we didn't increase our strength. So we go from a 60% chance to hit to a 51% chance to hit. But we are delivering more base damage. We're now doing 22 base damage. So that's 11.22. And then we're going to add our critical damage. And our critical damage is no different than if we had raised our strength, because your chance of rolling a 20 is the same regardless of what your base chance to hit is. So again, we're adding about 1 to that. So what ends up happening is, does greater weapon mastery deliver more damage? Yes. Does it deliver a lot more damage? Not really. It's just a little bit more. That throws conventional wisdom in the fire. Don't get me wrong. Greater weapon mastery is still probably your right choice at 4th level because it does increase your damage. And don't forget, you also have the chance of using your bonus action for additional attacks and that kind of thing. So greater weapon mastery is still a good investment. But this idea that you're going to get 10 extra damage, that the advantage is going to take care of that -5, that's false. That's a myth. The reality is you're going to do a little more damage on average, but very little more. Now we can see in that case that criticals didn't make any difference at all. So why are we doing all this extra work in calculating for criticals? Because sometimes builds are based on criticals. Think for a moment that you have, say, a Hexblade Paladin, and that Hexblade Paladin maybe is going to be using smites, but only if they do criticals. So how about Elven Accuracy? How does that work? Well, instead of squaring our chance to miss, we're going to cube our chance to miss. And we're going to cube our chance of not doing a critical. So in this very situation, what we end up with is about a 27% chance of doing a critical with every attack. So that's how we determine average damage. We're going to take our chance to hit, multiply it by our average damage per hit, and then we're going to add any extra damage we would expect from a critical, multiplied by the chance of achieving that critical. Sounds more complicated than it is, but I'll tell you, when you're comparing a build, every single level is actually a fair bit of work. And I just did that with a ranger. Not just a ranger, a 20th level ranger. And not just a 20th level ranger, a 20th level beastmaster. And not just a 20th level beastmaster, a 20th level beastmaster that uses its beast to attack every round. And not just that, I didn't use any strange sources. I didn't use any house rules. It is completely legal by law, and it delivers the damage. How much damage does it deliver? This much versus the baselines we talked about today. So could it be that the Beastmaster is not broken after all? If you make the right optimization decisions, and I'm not talking about anything illegal, I'm not talking about anything that's a house rule, I'm not talking about accessing Unearthed Arcana. I'm just talking about Player's Handbook, the Monster Manual, and Xanathar's. Based on those 3 books alone and completely legal stuff, this is what we can achieve. And I'm going to show you exactly how. I'm going to prove it mathematically on our next video. So I hope I'll see you then when I prove to you that, you know what, Rangers weren't as bad as you thought. 20 levels of Ranger isn't as bad as you thought. And the Beastmaster isn't as bad as you thought. You know what's worse than you thought? Monks. Sorry, I've worked and I've worked and I've worked on monks based on these baselines, and it just doesn't add up, or I haven't found a way for it to add up. If you know a way to make monks add up, I'd love that information. But as it happens, Rangers don't suck. They don't suck. They do good damage as long as you play things properly. And I'm going to show you exactly how in our next video. So until then, I'm going to sit back and I am going to relax and I'm going to have some fun because D&D is for everyone. Thanks, guys. I'll see you next time for a 20th level Beastmaster Ranger that doesn't suck.